Hi, I'm Natalie Brooks. For 24 years, I believed my mother chose everything over me. Her patients, her causes, even strangers on the street seemed to matter more than her own daughter. Every birthday she missed, every graduation she skipped, every tear I cried alone while she was saving the world, convinced me I was invisible to the one person who should have seen me most clearly. But what I discovered in that safety deposit box didn't just change everything I thought I knew about my mother. It shattered my understanding of sacrifice, love, and what it really means to protect the people you care about most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the windows of my studio apartment like an accusation. Each drop seemed to whisper the same question that had haunted me for months. Why wasn't I enough for her to stay? I sat cross-legged on my unmade bed, staring at the voicemail notification that had been blinking on my phone for 3 days. Mom's voice, probably calling to cancel another plan, to explain another emergency that was more important than spending time with her only daughter. I couldn't bring myself to listen to it. Not after what happened at Marcus's engagement party last weekend. The whole family had gathered at my brother's house in Laurelhurst, the kind of sprawling Victorian that screamed success and stability. Mom had promised she'd be there. She'd even asked me to help her pick out a dress the week before, something that felt so normal, so maternal, that I'd let myself hope this time would be different. This time she'd show up for something that mattered to me. But as Marcus raised his champagne glass to toast his fiancée, the chair next to me remained empty. Not just empty, glaringly, embarrassingly vacant. Dad kept checking his watch, making excuses to anyone who asked. "She's just running late," he'd say, his smile strained. "You know, Carmen, always one more patient to check on." The worst part wasn't even her absence. It was watching Marcus barely notice. He'd grown accustomed to Mom's ghost-like presence in our family, the way she drifted in and out of our lives like morning fog. But I couldn't let go. I couldn't stop expecting her to choose us, to choose me, just once. When I finally left the party, Dad followed me to the driveway. The October air was sharp, cutting through my thin cardigan as I fumbled for my car keys. "Natalie, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying that careful tone he always used when he was about to defend her. "Your mother didn't want to miss this. There was an emergency at the hospital." "There's always an emergency, Dad." The words came out harsher than I intended, but I was tired of pretending this was normal. "There was an emergency when I graduated high school. There was an emergency during my college graduation. There was even an emergency on my 21st birthday, when we were supposed to have that mother-daughter dinner you both promised." Dad's shoulders sagged. In the porch light, he looked older than his 58 years, worn down by decades of being the bridge between Mom's world and ours. "She loves you, you know that, right?" "Does she?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with years of accumulated hurt. "Because love is supposed to show up, Dad. Love is supposed to be present." That conversation had been echoing in my head for days. Now, sitting in my small apartment with the Portland skyline barely visible through the rain, I felt that familiar ache of wanting something I'd never quite been able to name. Not just my mother's attention, but her presence. The kind of mother who knew my coffee order, who remembered which movies made me cry, who showed up not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The truth was, I barely knew Carmen Brooks beyond her public persona. To the world, she was Saint Carmen, the ICU nurse who worked triple shifts, who volunteered at free clinics on her days off, who organized medical missions to underserved communities. The local newspaper had done a feature on her last year, calling her Portland's Angel of Mercy. They'd used a photo of her in scrubs, looking tired but radiant, surrounded by grateful patients. I'd cut out that article and put it in my desk drawer, not sure why I kept it. Maybe because it was easier to love the stranger in the newspaper than to confront the absence in my own life. My phone buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. A text from Aunt Diane. "Coffee tomorrow? I have something I think you should see." Diane was Mom's younger sister, but they couldn't have been more different. Where Mom was constantly in motion, chasing the next crisis. Diane was steady, reliable. She owned a small bookstore in the Alberta Arts District and had been more of a maternal presence in my life than my actual mother ever was. When I was 12 and got my first period at school, it was Diane who picked me up and took me to buy supplies, explaining everything with gentle patience while Mom was pulling another double shift. I texted back, "Sure. The usual place? Yes, 10 a.m. And Natalie? Bring tissues." That last part made my stomach clench. Diane wasn't dramatic or cryptic. If she was warning me to bring tissues, whatever she wanted to show me was going to hurt. I spent the rest of the evening trying to distract myself with work. I was a freelance graphic designer, specializing in small business branding, and I had a logo project due for a local bakery. But every time I tried to focus on color palettes and font choices, my mind drifted back to that voicemail, still blinking on my phone like a tiny lighthouse calling me towards something I wasn't sure I wanted to discover. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams, where I was always searching for my mother in endless hospital corridors, following the sound of her voice but never quite catching up. Morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical for October in Portland. I dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue sweater that Diane had complimented before, as if looking put together might somehow armor me against whatever she wanted to share. The coffee shop where we always met was a tiny place called Rosalind's, tucked between a vintage clothing store and a used bookshop. It was the kind of neighborhood establishment where the baristas knew your order, and the mismatched furniture felt like home. Diane was already there when I arrived, sitting at our usual table by the window. She looked uncharacteristically serious, her usually warm brown eyes shadowed with something I couldn't identify. In front of her sat a manila envelope, thick with documents and what looked like an old jewelry box. "Hey, kiddo," she said, standing to hug me. Her embrace lasted longer than usual, and I could feel tension in her shoulders. "Thanks for coming." I slid into the chair across from her, suddenly nervous. "Diane, what's going on? You're scaring me a little." She sighed, her fingers drumming against the table. "Your mom called me last night. She finally told me why she's been so absent all these years." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "Natalie, what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you see everything. Your mother, your childhood, the reason she's never been able to be the mom you deserved." Diane's voice was careful, measured. "But I need you to promise me you'll listen to the whole story before you make any judgments." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Okay." Diane opened the jewelry box first, revealing a stack of photographs. She handed me the top one, and my breath caught. It was my mother, but younger, maybe in her early 20s. She was holding a baby. Not me, I was sure of that. The baby looked to be maybe 6 months old, with dark hair and serious eyes. Mom looked exhausted but radiant, the way she did in the newspaper photo, but more raw, more real. "Who is this?" I whispered. "Her name was Sophia," Diane said quietly. "Your mother's first daughter." The world tilted. I stared at the photograph, trying to process what she was saying. "First daughter? What do you mean, first daughter?" Diane reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Your mother had a baby when she was 22 before she met your father. Sophia lived for 8 months before she died of sudden infant death syndrome." The photograph trembled in my hands. I could see it now. The fierce protectiveness in Mom's eyes. The way she held this baby like she was trying to shield her from the entire world. Why didn't she ever tell me? Quote,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Because," quote, Diane said, her voice breaking slightly, "losing Sophia nearly destroyed her. She blamed herself, even though the doctors assured her there was nothing she could have done. Your mother threw herself into studying everything she could about pediatric care, infant health, emergency medicine. She became a nurse because she couldn't save Sophia, but maybe she could save someone else's child." I set the photograph down with shaking hands. "But that still doesn't explain why she was never there for Marcus and me." Diane pulled out another photograph, this one more recent. It showed Mom in what looked like a makeshift medical clinic, treating a small child while several other children waited nearby. The setting was clearly impoverished. Bare concrete walls, basic equipment, worried parents hovering in the background. For the past 15 years, Diane continued, your mother has been running an underground medical network for undocumented families. Free healthcare, no questions asked, no documentation required. She's been using her own money, her own time, even falsifying some records to get medications and treatments for children whose parents can't risk going to official hospitals. My mind reeled. That's illegal. Yes, Diane said simply. It's also why she's never been able to talk about where she goes, why she misses family events, why she can't explain her absences. She's been protecting not just these families, but you and Marcus and your father. If anyone discovered what she was doing, she could lose her nursing license, face criminal charges, and everyone she's been helping would lose their only source of medical care. I stared at the photograph, seeing my mother in an entirely new light. The exhaustion I'd always read as indifference, the secrecy I'd interpreted as rejection. It was all protection, not just for the families she was helping, but for us. How many people has she helped? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Diane opened the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Over 300 children in the past decade and a half. Their names, their conditions, their treatments. She's kept records of everything, partly for medical continuity and partly because she wanted to remember every single life she'd touched. She handed me the stack, and I began flipping through page after page of careful notes in Mom's handwriting. A 7-year-old with asthma who couldn't afford an inhaler. A toddler with a severe ear infection whose parents were too afraid to seek treatment. A teenage girl who needed emergency contraception after an assault, but couldn't go to a hospital where they might call immigration services. Each entry was detailed, compassionate, and signed with a small heart next to Mom's initials. The same heart she used to draw on the rare notes she'd leave in my lunchbox when I was little. There's more, Diane said gently. She pulled out a letter, folded and refolded so many times the creases were wearing thin. She wrote this to you on your 18th birthday but never sent it. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the letter. Mom's handwriting filled both sides of the paper, cramped and urgent, as if she'd been racing to get the words out before she lost her nerve. My dearest Natalie, it began. Today you turn 18, and I know you think I don't see you, don't value you, don't love you enough to be present in your life. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every day I miss with you is a day I mourn. Every event I can't attend feels like a piece of my heart being carved away. But I need you to understand that everything I do, every sacrifice I make, is to build a world where children like Sophia don't die needlessly, where families don't have to choose between seeking medical care and keeping their families together. The letter went on to describe some of the children she'd helped, but always came back to me and Marcus, to how proud she was of us, how much she wished she could be the mother we deserved, while still being the advocate these vulnerable families needed. I know this sounds like excuses, the letter continued, and maybe it is. Maybe I'm a coward for not finding a way to do both, to be both the mother you need and the healer these children require. But every time I think about stopping, about choosing our family over theirs, I see Sophia's face. I see all the Sophias who might not have to die if I can just help one more family, treat one more child, make one more difference. The letter ended with, I hope someday you'll understand that my absence was never about not loving you. It was about loving you so much that I wanted to help build a world worthy of you. I hope someday you can forgive me for all the ways I failed to show you how much you matter to me. You are my heart walking around outside my body, and every day I can't hold you close is a day I feel incomplete. All my love, always, Mom. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. The coffee shop around us had faded away, and all I could see were the words on the page, the weight of everything I'd misunderstood for so many years. Why are you showing me this now? I managed to ask through my tears. Diane's own eyes were wet. Because your mother is sick, Natalie. She's been hiding it, of course, because she doesn't want to burden anyone. But she has stage 3 ovarian cancer. And she's finally decided to stop the underground clinic work so she can focus on treatment. She wanted me to tell you and Marcus everything, to help you understand why she made the choices she did. The world seemed to stop spinning. All the anger I'd carried, all the resentment and hurt feelings, suddenly felt so small compared to this revelation. My mother wasn't absent because she didn't care. She was absent because she cared too much, about everyone, about a world where children could get the medical care they needed regardless of their families, legal status. How long has she known? I whispered. About the cancer? 3 months. But she's been feeling the symptoms for probably a year. Diane reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a key. She wants to see you, Natalie. Really see you, talk to you, try to rebuild what she knows she damaged. But she wanted you to understand the whole truth first. I took the key, feeling its weight in my palm. What's this for? A storage unit where she keeps supplies for the clinic, but also where she's been saving things for you and Marcus. Letters she never sent, gifts she never gave, photographs she never showed you. Evidence of all the ways she's been loving you from a distance. I closed my fist around the key, feeling something shift inside my chest. The hurt was still there, but it was different now. Not the sharp pain of rejection, but the duller ache of understanding. My mother had made an impossible choice, and maybe it was the wrong choice, but it came from a place of love so deep and complex that I was only beginning to understand its depths. Diane, I said finally, I need to see her. I need to talk to her. She's at home today, Diane said, squeezing my hand. She's been hoping you'd say that. As I sat there in Rosalind's, surrounded by the ordinary bustle of a Tuesday morning, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family, about my mother, about myself, was about to change. The voicemail on my phone, the one I'd been too afraid to listen to, suddenly seemed less like a burden and more like a bridge. For the first time in years, I felt like I was about to meet my mother not as the absent figure who had disappointed me, but as the complex, flawed, deeply loving woman who had been carrying impossible burdens while trying to protect everyone she cared about, including me. The rain had stopped while we talked, and weak sunlight was beginning to filter through the coffee shop windows. It felt like an omen, like the first glimpse of clarity after a long, dark storm. I was scared of what came next, but for the first time in my adult life, I was ready to really listen to what my mother had to say. The drive to my childhood home felt like traveling through a time warp. Every familiar street corner brought back memories that now seemed filtered through a different lens. The house where I grew up sat on a quiet tree-lined street in Laurelhurst, its craftsman-style architecture unchanged but somehow smaller than I remembered. The maple tree Dad had planted when I was 5 towered over the front yard now, its orange and red leaves carpeting the walkway like a welcome mat. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine off, staring at the front door I'd walked through thousands of times. The voicemail on my phone felt heavier now, weighted with new understanding. Finally, I pressed play. Natalie, sweetheart, it's Mom. Her voice sounded tired, more fragile than I remembered. I know you're angry about the engagement party, and you have every right to be. I've made so many mistakes, missed so many important moments, but there are things you don't know, things I've never been able to tell you. Diane says she's going to talk to you today, and I hope when you understand everything, you might find it in your heart to give your old mom another chance. I love you more than you could ever know, and I'm ready to stop hiding behind my excuses. Please come home when you're ready. I'll be here. The message ended with a sound that might have been a stifled sob. I deleted it immediately, not because I was angry anymore, but because I wanted to preserve this moment of transition, this space between not knowing and knowing where we could build something new. The front door opened before I could knock. Mom stood there in jeans and an old Oregon State sweatshirt, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a professional bun, hung loose around her shoulders, showing more gray than I remembered. But her eyes were the same warm brown they'd always been, now bright with unshed tears. "Hi, baby," she said simply. "Hi, Mom." We stood there for a moment, taking each other in across the threshold that had separated us for so long. Then she stepped aside, gesturing me into the living room where I'd spent countless hours as a child, building pillow forts and watching Saturday morning cartoons while she caught a few hours of sleep between shifts. The room looked exactly the same: worn leather furniture, family photos covering every surface, Dad's collection of vintage medical textbooks filling the built-in shelves. But now I noticed things I'd missed before. The framed certificate from the Oregon Nurses Association hanging next to my high school graduation photo. A small silver frame containing what looked like a child's drawing, carefully preserved behind glass. "That's from Sophia," Mom said, following my gaze. She was only 8 months old, but she loved to grab crayons and scribble. I found this tucked in her diaper bag after we lost her. It's probably just random marks, but I've always imagined she was trying to draw a heart. I moved closer to look at the simple crayon marks, purple and red swirls that could have been anything. But in the gentle afternoon light streaming through the windows, they did look remarkably like a heart. "Diane told me about Sophia," I said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Mom, I can't imagine losing a child." Mom's face crumpled for just a moment before she composed herself. "Thank you. It's been 30 years, and some days it still feels like yesterday. But talking about her, it feels good to say her name out loud with someone who knows." We settled onto the couch, the same spots we'd occupied for countless childhood conversations, though those had usually been hurried exchanges between her coming and going. Now we had time, real time, to sit and look at each other without the weight of unspoken obligations pulling her away. "I don't know where to start," Mom said, twisting her hands in her lap. "Diane showed you some of it, I know. But there's so much more I need you to understand." "Start wherever feels right," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. "You know, that's exactly what I said to Sophia the night before she died. She was fussy, couldn't sleep, and I walked her around this house for hours, telling her stories, singing lullabies. I kept saying, 'Mama's not going anywhere, baby girl. We have all the time in the world.'" Her voice caught, but she continued. "The next morning, I went to wake her up for her feeding, and she was just gone. Peaceful, like she was sleeping, but cold. The paramedics said it probably happened hours earlier, while I was sleeping in the next room. For months afterward, I tortured myself thinking about those hours. What if I'd checked on her sooner? What if I'd heard something? What if I'd never gone to sleep at all?" I reached for her hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "Mom, you know that wasn't your fault, right?" "Intellectually, yes. But knowing something and feeling it are two different things." After Sophia died, I threw myself into learning everything I could about infant care, pediatric emergencies, signs and symptoms I might have missed. I changed my major from psychology to nursing, specializing in critical care. I needed to become the kind of person who could save babies, who would know what to look for, who would never miss another warning sign. She paused, staring at Sophia's drawing. "I met your father 2 years later, in the pediatric ICU where I was working. He was a resident doing his rotation, and we bonded over our shared obsession with keeping children safe. When you and Marcus were born, I was terrified every single night. I would check on you both constantly, monitoring your breathing, taking your temperatures, looking for any sign that something might be wrong." The pieces were starting to fit together. "Is that why you became so involved with the clinic work?" "Partly, but it really started when I met Rosa Gutierrez in the emergency room about 15 years ago. She'd brought her 4-year-old son in with a severe asthma attack, and she was so frightened, not just of losing him, but of what would happen to their family if hospital administration called immigration services. I stayed with them through his treatment, helped translate with the doctors, and when they were ready to discharge him, Rosa begged me to help her find a way to get his inhaler refilled without having to come back to the hospital." Mom stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the maple tree. I started making some calls, reaching out to other nurses, doctors, social workers. I discovered there was an entire community of families living in the shadows, afraid to seek medical care for their children because they were more afraid of deportation than disease. Children were suffering, some were dying, from completely treatable conditions because their parents couldn't risk the exposure. "So you started the underground clinic," I said. "Not at first. Initially, I just helped individual families connect with resources, found ways to get medications donated, arranged for friendly doctors to see children off the books. But the need was so much greater than I realized. There were families driving from as far away as Salem and Eugene, desperate for someone who would treat their children without asking for documentation. She turned back to face me. I kept thinking about Sophia, about how I couldn't save her, but maybe I could save these other children. Maybe her death could have meaning if I could prevent other families from losing their babies to treatable conditions. But why didn't you tell us? Why the secrecy? Mom sat back down, closer this time, our knees almost touching. Because what I was doing was illegal, Natalie. Practicing medicine without proper licensing, falsifying records to get medications, sometimes even hiding families in our spare room when they needed somewhere safe to recover after procedures. If I'd been caught, I could have lost my nursing license, faced federal charges for harboring undocumented immigrants, possibly even been charged with drug trafficking for moving prescription medications. The weight of what she was saying began to sink in. You risked everything. I risked everything because these children were dying, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help. But I also couldn't risk exposing you and Marcus and your father to the consequences of my choices. The less you knew, the safer you were. But you missed so much of our lives, I said, the old hurt creeping back into my voice despite my new understanding. I know. Her voice was barely a whisper. I know I did, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you separate from that world, but I was also protecting myself from having to choose between you and them. As long as I could compartmentalize, I didn't have to admit that I was failing as a mother. She reached for her purse and pulled out a small leather journal, worn soft from years of handling. I wrote to you every day, Natalie. Every single day for the past 10 years. Letters I never sent, stories about the work I was doing, explanations for why I missed this event or that milestone. I wanted you to understand, but I was too afraid of what would happen if you knew the truth. She handed me the journal and I opened it to a random page. The entry was dated 3 years ago, my 21st birthday. My dearest Natalie, it read, "Today you turned 21, and I'm missing your celebration because I'm in a motel room in Bend with a teenage girl named Carmen. I named her after me when her mother brought her across the border as a baby who just gave birth to a premature son. There are no documents, no prenatal care records, no way to get them to a hospital without risking the entire family's deportation. I'm using skills I learned 30 years ago in the NICU to keep this tiny boy alive until I can arrange safe transport to a doctor who can help. I wish I were with you instead, buying you your first legal drink, hearing about your plans for the future, celebrating the amazing woman you've become. But this baby needs me to be his lifeline tonight, and I hope someday you'll understand why I had to choose his life over our celebration." Tears blurred my vision as I read. You named her Carmen? After Sophia died, I couldn't imagine ever having children again. But when I met this pregnant teenager who had crossed the desert alone, something in me recognized her courage. Her mother had died during the crossing, and she was all alone, about to give birth with no support system. When she asked me to name her daughter, I gave her my name because I wanted that little girl to carry some part of the love I couldn't give to my own daughter who died. I flipped through more pages, reading entries about missed Christmas mornings because she was treating a child with pneumonia, skipped graduation ceremonies because she was helping a family evacuate when immigration raids threatened their community, absent birthdays because she was training other nurses to provide care in safe houses. Each entry ended the same way. I love you more than you know, and I hope someday you'll forgive me. Mom, I said, closing the journal carefully. I spent so many years thinking you didn't care about us, that your work was more important than your family. It was never more important, she said firmly. But I convinced myself that the two things couldn't coexist, that I had to choose between being a good mother and being someone who could help these families. I was wrong about that. I should have found a way to include you and Marcus in understanding why this work mattered, should have helped you see how our privilege could be used to help others. Would you have done anything differently? I asked. She was quiet for a long time, considering. I would have been honest with you from the beginning. I would have let you see that helping others doesn't have to mean abandoning your family. I would have asked for your help instead of shutting you out. And I would have made sure you knew, every single day, that missing your events was the hardest part of all of it. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the familiar room. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the weight of revelations and lost time. "Diane told me you're sick," I said finally. Mom nodded, her hands folding protectively over her abdomen. "Ovarian cancer. Stage 3. I've been ignoring symptoms for months because I didn't want to stop the clinic work, didn't want to abandon the families who depend on me. But last week I collapsed during a procedure, and the doctor I work with, Dr. Martinez, insisted on running tests. What's the prognosis? With aggressive treatment, good. Better than I expected. But it means chemotherapy, surgery, months of recovery. It means I can't continue the underground work. At least not in the same way. Other people are stepping up to take over most of it, but it's hard to let go of something that's defined me for so long." I reached for her hand again. "Maybe this is a chance to redefine yourself. To figure out who you are when you're not carrying the weight of saving everyone." "Maybe," she said, squeezing my fingers. "I'd like to figure out who I am as your mother again, if you'll let me." The offer hung between us, fragile and hopeful. Part of me wanted to leap at it immediately, to forgive everything and start fresh. But another part of me, the part that had been wounded by years of absence, needed time to process this new understanding of our relationship. "I'd like that too," I said carefully, "but I need some time to think about what that looks like. This is a lot to take in." "Of course," Mom said. "I've had 30 years to live with these choices and their consequences. You've had 30 minutes to rewrite your entire understanding of our family. Take all the time you need." She stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room, returning with a key identical to the one Diane had given me. "This is for the storage unit. There are things there I've been saving for you and Marcus, but also documents and supplies from the clinic work. I want you to see all of it, the good and the difficult parts. I want you to understand the full scope of what I've been doing with my life, so you can make an informed decision about whether you want me in yours." I took the key, feeling its significance. "What happens to all those families now, the ones who've been depending on you? They'll be okay?" Dr. Martinez has been building a network of volunteer medical professionals, and there are legal clinics starting to offer some of the same services through proper channels. "The work will continue, just not with me at the center of it." She paused. "For the first time in 15 years, I get to choose my family first. If you'll have me." I stood up, suddenly needing to move, to think, to process everything that had shifted in the space of a single afternoon. "I should go. I need some time to digest all of this." "I understand," Mom said, walking me to the door. "Natalie, thank you for coming today. Thank you for listening." At the threshold, I turned back to look at her. In the doorway of my childhood home, she looked both exactly the same and completely different. Still my mother, but now a complex, flawed, deeply committed woman whose sacrifices I was only beginning to understand. "Mom, I love you too. I've always loved you. I just didn't understand how to love someone who felt so far away." Her smile was radiant, transforming her tired face. "You don't feel far away anymore." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Portland, I felt like I was seeing everything with new eyes. The city looked the same, but my understanding of my place in it had fundamentally shifted. My mother wasn't the absent, self-absorbed woman I'd constructed in my mind. She was someone who had carried impossible burdens while trying to protect everyone she loved, including me. The question now was what to do with this new knowledge, and whether 2 decades of hurt could be healed by understanding the love that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of necessary secrecy and misguided protection. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a mother again. But I also knew that rebuilding our relationship would require more than just understanding her choices. It would require both of us learning how to love each other openly, honestly, and without the weight of secrets standing between us. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to visit the storage unit. The keys sat on my kitchen counter like twin accusers, demanding attention I wasn't ready to give. I spent those days in a strange limbo, working mechanically on client projects while my mind churned through everything Mom had told me. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams where I was 8 years old again, searching empty hospital corridors for a mother who was always just around the next corner. On Thursday morning, I finally drove to the storage facility on the outskirts of Gresham. The place was a sprawling complex of identical white buildings, sterile and anonymous. Unit 247 was tucked away in the back corner, far from the main office, where curious employees might notice unusual comings and goings. The first key opened the main lock, but when I rolled up the metal door, I discovered a second steel door with a heavy deadbolt. This wasn't just storage. It was a fortress designed to protect whatever lay inside from discovery. The second key turned with a satisfying click, and I stepped into what could only be described as a makeshift medical facility. The space was larger than I'd expected, perhaps 20 feet deep, with fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling and medical equipment arranged with military precision. There were examination tables, IV stands, monitors, and cabinets full of supplies that would have cost thousands of dollars if purchased legally. But it was the personal items scattered throughout that made my breath catch. A bulletin board covered with children's drawings, thank you notes, written in careful English and flowing Spanish, photographs of families whose faces glowed with gratitude and relief. In one corner sat a desk where my mother had clearly spent countless hours, its surface worn smooth from use. Patient files were organized in neat stacks, each one representing a life she'd touched, a family she'd helped navigate the treacherous waters of seeking medical care while undocumented. I approached the desk cautiously, feeling like an intruder in this sacred space. A framed photo sat next to an old computer, Mom with a group of children, all of them laughing at something beyond the camera's reach. She looked younger in the picture, maybe 5 years ago, but also more alive than I'd ever seen her. This was her element, her calling, the place where she transformed from the exhausted woman who stumbled home from official work into someone radiant with purpose. The computer was password protected, but I found a notebook beside it filled with Mom's careful handwriting. The entries were clinical notes mixed with personal observations, professional assessments tangled with emotional reactions to the families she treated. Miguel Santos, age 6, asthma exacerbations secondary to mold exposure in overcrowded housing. Provided albuterol inhaler and spacer device. Educated family on trigger avoidance. Note: this child's wheezing reminds me of Marcus at that age. Different circumstances. Same desperate love from parents who just want their baby to breathe. Carmen Elena Reyes, age 8 months, fever and lethargy. Ruled out meningitis, treated for viral syndrome. Family drove 6 hours from Eastern Oregon after local clinic refused to see undocumented patients. Note: named for me according to mother. Holds my finger the same way Sophia used to. Some connections transcend documentation status. Page after page of careful medical notes interwoven with maternal observations, professional competence laced with personal grief and hope. Reading her words, I began to understand how this work had allowed her to channel her loss into purpose, to transform her inability to save Sophia into a mission, to save every other child she could reach. In the bottom drawer of the desk, I found what Diane must have meant when she mentioned gifts never given. A wooden box contained items that were clearly meant for Marcus and me over the years. Jewelry for birthdays she'd missed, books for Christmas mornings she'd spent at the clinic, graduation gifts she'd been too absent to present. Each item was wrapped carefully and labeled with dates and occasions, preserved like artifacts of the mother she'd wanted to be but couldn't figure out how to become. The birthday present from my 16th birthday was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with coordinates. When I pulled out my phone to look them up, I discovered they marked the location of Multnomah Falls, where Mom had taken me for a mother-daughter hike when I was 12, one of the few pure, uninterrupted days we'd ever spent together. The memory came flooding back. How we'd climbed the trail together, how she'd told me stories about the native peoples who considered the falls sacred, how we'd sat on rocks and shared trail mix while she pointed out different birds and plants. "I brought you here," she'd said that day, "because sometimes we need to remember that beautiful things are worth the difficult climb to reach them." I'd treasured that memory for years. One of the few times I'd felt like I had my mother's complete attention. Now I realized she'd been trying to create touchstones for me, moments of connection that could sustain me through all the times she couldn't be present. Wrapped with the bracelet was a letter. The ink slightly faded, but the words still clear. "My darling Natalie, today you turn 16, and I'm missing your party because I'm treating a teenage girl who was assaulted while crossing the border. She's exactly your age, but she's been forced to grow up in ways no child should have to. I think about how different your lives are, how geography and citizenship create such different possibilities. I hope someday you'll understand that the freedom to be young and safe and celebrated is something I want to preserve for every child, not just my own. The bracelet marks the coordinates of our day at the falls, because I want you to remember that some things are worth the climb, even when the path is harder than we expected. I fastened the bracelet around my wrist, feeling the weight of 16 years of missed connection, settling into something that felt more like understanding. Mom hadn't forgotten my birthday. She'd been carrying it with her, along with the guilt of choosing someone else's crisis over my celebration. The back wall of the storage unit was covered with a massive map of Oregon and Washington, marked with colored pins that indicated families she'd helped, safe houses where people could recover, and network connections she'd built over 15 years of underground work. Red pins marked emergency locations, blue pins indicated ongoing patients, and yellow pins showed families who had successfully transitioned to legal medical care or achieved documented status. Hundreds of pins. Hundreds of families whose lives had been touched by my mother's willingness to risk everything. I was studying the map when I heard footsteps outside the unit. My heart hammered as I realized I had no idea who else might have access to this place, who might know about Mom's work, whether I was about to encounter someone who saw me as a threat to the careful secrecy she'd maintained. Natalie? A woman's voice, accented but speaking careful English. You are Carmen's daughter, yes? I turned to see a petite woman in her 40s, dark hair streaked with premature gray, wearing scrubs that marked her as medical personnel. Her face was kind but guarded, and she carried herself with the cautious confidence of someone accustomed to operating in shadows. Yes, I said. I'm Natalie Brooks. Her face transformed with relief and something that looked like joy. I am Dr. Elena Martinez. Your mother. She speaks of you always. She shows pictures, tells stories, worries about you constantly, even when she pretends to be focused on work. This was the doctor Mom had mentioned, the one who had insisted on running tests when she collapsed. I felt a mixture of gratitude and curiosity about this woman, who had been working alongside my mother in secret for years. She told me about you too, I said. Thank you for taking care of her, for making her get the tests done. Dr. Martinez smiled sadly. Your mother, she is one of the most stubborn women I have ever known. She will treat everyone else's children, but ignore her own health. When she collapsed during procedure last week, I thought we had lost her. She has been pushing herself too hard for too long. How did you meet her? How did all of this start? I was working emergency room at Emmanuel Hospital, maybe 8 years ago. Carmen brought in family who had been in car accident. Father, mother, 2 small children. They were undocumented, terrified, and the children were seriously injured. Carmen had found them on side of road, used her own car to bring them to hospital, and stayed with them through entire treatment. Dr. Martinez leaned against the doorframe, her eyes distant with memory. Hospital administration wanted to call immigration services because family could not pay, but Carmen convinced them to let her handle it. She paid their entire bill from her own savings, arranged follow-up care, even helped them find better housing when we discovered their injuries were worse because they had been living in their car. She paid their medical bills? Of course she did. This is your mother we discuss. She sees child in pain. She does whatever necessary to fix it. After that family recovered, word spread in community that there was nurse who would help, who would not turn families away, who could be trusted. Dr. Martinez gestured toward the medical equipment around us. Eventually, I began referring families to her when hospital could not help safely. I would donate supplies that were close to expiration, share information about cases that needed follow-up but could not come back to official facility. When demand grew too large for Carmen to handle alone, I started volunteering here on my days off. This must have been risky for you too, I said. Less risky for me than for Carmen, she admitted. I have documented status, established practice, more protection if discovered. But yes, we could both lose everything if authorities found out. Carmen never let me forget that. Never let anyone take risks they could not afford. She walked to the bulletin board and touched one of the children's drawings gently. But some things are worth the risk. You see these pictures, these thank you notes? Each one represents child who is alive and healthy because your mother refused to let documentation status determine access to medical care. How many people know about this? Very few. Maybe dozen volunteers total over the years, all people Carmen trusted completely. We change locations periodically, never stay in one place too long, always careful about who has access. Your mother, she protects everyone, patients, volunteers, even her own family, by keeping circles of knowledge small and separate. Dr. Martinez studied my face carefully. She has been worried about telling you truth. Worried you would think less of her, or that knowledge would put you in danger. I told her children are stronger than parents think, that secrets hurt more than truth, but she was too frightened to listen. I'm not sure I would have understood before, I admitted. I was so angry about her being absent. I don't think I could have seen past my own hurt to understand why she was making these choices. And now? I looked around the storage unit, taking in the evidence of my mother's double life, the medical equipment that had saved lives, the thank you notes from grateful families, the gifts she'd bought but never given, the careful records of every person she'd helped. It was overwhelming and heartbreaking and inspiring all at once. Quote, "Now I think she's been carrying an impossible burden alone for too long," I said. "And I think I want to help carry some of it." Dr. Martinez smiled, the first completely unguarded expression I'd seen from her. This is what she hoped you would say. What she dreamed you would say but was too afraid to expect. What happens now, with her sick and unable to continue the work? We have been preparing for this transition for months, even before her diagnosis. Network has grown larger, more sustainable. Legal aid organizations are taking over some functions, community health workers are handling others. The need will not disappear, but structure can exist without Carmen at center. She paused, considering her words carefully. But there are some families, some children, who have special connection to your mother. Cases she has followed for years. Relationships that go beyond medical care into something more like family. These transitions will be harder. Could I meet some of them? The words surprised me as I spoke them. I mean, if Mom agrees, and if they're comfortable with it, I'd like to understand this part of her life better. I think Carmen would love that, Dr. Martinez said softly. There is a young woman, Carmen Elena, the one named for your mother. She is 18 now, about to start college with scholarship Carmen helped her obtain. And Santos family, whose son Miguel has been patient for 6 years. They have been asking about Carmen since her collapse, worried about her health, wanting to help her the way she helped them. The idea that these families, whom I'd never met, were concerned about my mother's well-being while I'd been nursing my resentment about missed family dinners, struck me with sharp clarity. Mom hadn't been choosing strangers over family. She'd been expanding her definition of family to include anyone who needed her care. Dr. Martinez, I said, when you said Mom talks about me, what does she say? The doctor's smile was gentle. She says you are artist, that you create beauty for living. She says you are strong like her but kinder. That you inherited her stubbornness, but not her fear. She says she watches you from distance and sees woman she is proud to call daughter, even when she knows she has not earned right to pride. She shows you my work? Of course. She has portfolio of everything you design, printed from internet. She shows everyone your logos, your graphics, tells them her daughter makes beautiful things that help small businesses grow. She is most proud when she can say her daughter uses creativity to help people build their dreams. I felt tears starting and blinked them back. All this time, I'd thought Mom was indifferent to my career, uninterested in my life, because she never asked detailed questions or offered specific feedback. I'd interpreted her silence as disengagement, never imagining that she was following my work from afar, collecting examples of my success like treasures. There is something else, Dr. Martinez said, reaching into her pocket. Carmen asked me to give this to you if I thought you were ready to see it. She handed me a small key, different from the storage unit keys, with a paper tag marked Home Office. She has been documenting everything for years, not just for medical continuity, but also for protection. If anything happened to her, if authorities discovered the work, she wanted evidence of good it accomplished, families it helped, lives it saved. She has been preparing comprehensive record for you and Marcus, so you would understand scope of what she sacrificed for and why she believed it was worth the cost. I took the key, understanding that I was being offered access to the deepest secrets of my mother's heart, the complete record of the choices that had shaped our family's life for 15 years. Will you tell her I came here? That I'm beginning to understand? She will be so relieved, Dr. Martinez said. But Natalie, understanding is just first step. Your mother, she needs to learn how to be mother again, how to put family first without abandoning sense of purpose. And you need to decide if you can forgive, not just her choices but also years of pain they caused you. As I locked up the storage unit and drove back toward Portland, I felt like I was carrying the weight of 2 decades of family secrets, but also the possibility of redemption. The bracelet on my wrist caught the afternoon sunlight, reminding me of that perfect day at Multnomah Falls when I'd felt completely connected to my mother. Maybe understanding was just the first step, but it was a step towards something I'd given up hoping for, a relationship with my mother built on truth instead of silence, presence instead of absence, and love that didn't have to hide behind the noble fiction of protection. The drive home took me past Emmanuel Hospital, where this whole story had begun with a car accident, and my mother's inability to turn away from children in need. For the first time, I didn't feel resentment when I saw the building. Instead, I felt something like pride. My mother was flawed and absent and had made countless mistakes, but she was also someone who had risked everything to ensure that children could access medical care, regardless of their family's legal status. That evening, I sat in my apartment and called her for the first time in months, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. "Mom?" I said when she answered. "I went to the storage unit today. I met Dr. Martinez, and I think I'm ready to hear more of your story." The home office key opened a door I'd passed countless times, but never been invited to enter. Mom's study had always been off-limits during my childhood, a mysterious sanctuary where she disappeared for hours after her hospital shifts. Now, standing in the doorway with her permission, I understood why she'd guarded this space so carefully. The room was a command center for coordinating care across multiple undocumented communities. 3 computer monitors displayed encrypted messaging systems, appointment schedules, and medical supply inventories. File cabinets lined every wall, labeled with coded numbers rather than names to protect patient identities. But it was the personal touches that made my chest tighten. Photos of children she'd treated taped to her monitor, hand-drawn cards thanking Dr. Carmen for saving their siblings, and a small shrine in the corner dedicated to Sophia's memory. Mom appeared behind me, moving quietly in her slippers. She looked smaller in this space, more vulnerable, as if revealing her secret headquarters had stripped away some essential protection. "I've been working on a comprehensive record," she said, gesturing toward a thick binder on her desk. "Everything I've done, everyone I've helped, all the documentation that proves this work was about saving lives, not breaking laws for personal gain." I opened the binder to find hundreds of pages of meticulously organized information. Patient summaries, medication distribution logs, volunteer schedules, financial records showing thousands of dollars of her own money spent on supplies and treatment. Each page was initialed and dated, creating an undeniable timeline of systematic life-saving work. "Why document everything so carefully?" I asked. "Protection," she said simply. "If authorities ever discovered what I was doing, I wanted proof that every decision was medically justified, every medication properly administered, every treatment performed according to standard protocols. I also wanted you and Marcus to understand the scope of it all, to see that this wasn't reckless rebellion but carefully planned humanitarian work." She pulled out a separate folder marked Success Stories and opened it to reveal before and after photos, graduation announcements, wedding invitations, and birth certificates. Children she'd treated who had grown up to become productive community members. Families who had achieved legal status and no longer needed underground care. Teenagers who had received scholarships and were now attending universities across the country. Carmen Elena graduated from Oregon State last month with a degree in social work. Mom said, pointing to a photo of a beautiful young woman in cap and gown. She was the baby Dr. Martinez mentioned, the one named for me. Her mother brought her across the border at 8 months old, and she had chronic ear infections that could have caused permanent hearing loss if untreated. Now she's planning to become an advocate for immigrant families. She flipped to another page showing a wedding photo. Miguel Santos married his high school sweetheart last year. Remember him from my notes? The 6-year-old with asthma? He's 22 now, works as an EMT, and wants to become a paramedic. His parents still send me Christmas cards. Page after page of lives transformed, children who had grown into adults, families who had found stability and safety. The cumulative impact was staggering, but so was the realization of what this work had cost our family. "Mom," I said carefully, "I understand why this work mattered to you. I can see how many people you've helped, but I need you to understand something too." She nodded, bracing herself. "Marcus and I needed you too. We needed a mother who was present, who knew our friends, names, and our favorite subjects in school. We needed someone who showed up to our events not because she felt obligated, but because she wanted to celebrate our achievements." Her face crumpled. I know I failed you both in fundamental ways. But we also needed to understand why we were coming second." I continued. "If you had trusted us with the truth, if you had let us see what you were sacrificing for, we could have been proud of you instead of resentful. We could have found ways to help instead of feeling abandoned." She sat down heavily in her desk chair, the weight of 15 years of secret-keeping visible in her posture. "I was so afraid," she whispered, "afraid that if you knew how dangerous this work was, you'd ask me to stop. Afraid that if authorities discovered what I was doing, they'd come after you and Marcus too. Afraid that you'd think I was a criminal instead of a healer. What I think," I said, settling into the chair across from her, "is that you're someone who saw children suffering and couldn't turn away. What I think is that you channeled your grief over losing Sophia into something meaningful. What I also think is that you've been carrying this burden alone for so long that you forgot how to let other people help you carry it." She looked up at me with surprise. "You're not angry anymore?" "I'm still processing," I admitted. "There's a lot of hurt to work through, years of feeling like I wasn't important enough for your attention." "But anger?" "No. How can I be angry at someone who risked everything to keep children alive?" We sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of her double life. Then, my phone rang. Dr. Martinez's name appeared on the screen. "Natalie." Her voice was tense when I answered. "Is your mother with you? We have a situation that requires immediate attention." I put the call on speaker. "I'm here, Elena," Mom said. "What's happening?" Rosa Gutierrez called. "Immigration raid at apartment complex on Powell Boulevard. Families are scattered, children separated from parents. Several injured during the raid, one child with suspected broken arm, another having asthma attack. They're afraid to go to hospital." I watched Mom's face transform, the tired woman becoming the decisive healer I'd only heard about secondhand. "How many children? What supplies do we need? Where can we set up safe treatment space?" "Carmen," Dr. Martinez said gently, "you are not well enough for this. The chemotherapy starts next week. You cannot expose yourself to this stress right now. Elena, there are injured children who need medical care. I can't just—" "Yes, you can," I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "You can let someone else handle this crisis. You can trust the network you've built to function without you." Mom stared at me, clearly torn between her maternal instincts for the children in crisis and her need to focus on her own health. "But I know these families," she said. "I know their medical histories, their fears, what will help them feel safe. How can I just abandon them when they need help most?" I looked around the room, taking in all the documentation of her work, the careful systems she'd built, the relationships she'd fostered. Then I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. "You don't have to abandon them," I said, "but maybe you can help in a different way. What if you coordinated from here, used your knowledge to guide other people in providing the hands-on care?" Dr. Martinez's voice came through the speaker with cautious hope. Natalie, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Mom becomes the nerve center for this operation instead of the field medic. She knows these families, their histories, their needs. She can direct volunteers, coordinate supplies, make medical decisions from a safe distance while other people do the physical work. Mom looked at me with something like awe. You would help with this? I don't have medical training, I said, but I have other skills. I can organize information, coordinate communications, manage logistics. I can be your hands and feet while you be the brain. Over the next 6 hours, our house became mission control for the most complex rescue operation I'd ever witnessed. Mom sat at her computers, fielding calls from scattered families, coordinating with volunteers, and making rapid medical assessments based on descriptions from field workers. I found myself managing a spreadsheet of children's locations and conditions, updating a digital map of safe houses, and designing a simple communication system that allowed volunteers to relay information quickly without compromising anyone's safety. Dr. Martinez and 3 other medical volunteers provided on-site care while Mom directed their actions through encrypted video calls. She walked them through treating the child's broken arm, guided them in managing the asthma attack, and helped coordinate temporary housing for families whose apartments had been compromised. Miguel Santos is volunteering tonight, Mom told me during a brief break. The little boy with asthma I used to treat? He's now an EMT helping other children the way I once helped him. Watching her work from this new perspective, I finally understood the scope of what she'd been managing alone for 15 years. She wasn't just providing medical care. She was maintaining a complex network of relationships, tracking dozens of ongoing cases, coordinating resources across multiple organizations, and making life-or-death decisions while operating entirely outside legal medical systems. By 3 a.m, all the children were safe, the injured had been treated, and temporary housing had been arranged for displaced families. Mom finally leaned back in her chair, exhausted but satisfied. I couldn't have done that alone, she said. Having you here, having your help coordinating everything, it made all the difference. This is what it could have been like, I said quietly. If you had trusted me with the truth years ago, we could have been partners in this work instead of strangers living in the same house. She nodded, tears beginning to flow. I wasted so much time trying to protect you from something you could have helped me carry. Well, I said, we can't change the past, but we can decide what happens next. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus stood on our doorstep looking serious and slightly nervous, holding a bouquet of flowers that seemed inadequate for whatever conversation he'd come to have. Dad told me you've been talking, he said when Mom answered the door. He said there were things about your work that I should understand. Mom glanced at me and I nodded encouragingly. It was time for our family to stop operating on secrets and partial information. Come in, she said. There's a lot we need to discuss. The 3 of us spent the morning in the living room where I'd grown up, but the conversation we had was unlike any family discussion from my childhood. Mom explained everything to Marcus. Sophia's death, the underground clinic, the family she'd been helping, the reasons for her absences over the years. He listened with the same mixture of shock, hurt, and gradual understanding that I'd experienced. You could have told us, he said finally. We would have understood. We would have helped. I know that now, Mom replied. I was so focused on protecting everyone that I forgot trust is also a form of protection. What happens next? Marcus asked. With your treatment, with the clinic work, with our family. Before Mom could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. Channel 12 News is running story about immigration raid. They interviewed several families who mentioned Angel Nurse, who has been providing free care for years. Carmen's work is no longer secret. I showed the message to Mom and Marcus. Instead of the panic I expected, Mom's face showed something like relief. Maybe it's time, she said. Maybe hiding has done more harm than good. That afternoon, we watched the news story together. Several families, faces obscured for their protection, spoke about a nurse who had risked everything to provide medical care for their children. They described treatments that had saved lives, medications provided free of charge, and a woman who had shown up in their darkest moments when official systems had failed them. The reporter concluded with, "Immigration advocates are calling for protection for medical workers who provide emergency care regardless of documentation status. They argue that criminalizing such humanitarian efforts puts vulnerable children at risk and contradicts basic medical ethics." "They're protecting you," Marcus said with wonder. "The families you helped are speaking up to protect you." Mom's phone started ringing almost immediately. Reporters wanting interviews, legal advocates offering support, medical colleagues expressing solidarity. But the call that mattered most came from Carmen Elena, the young woman named for my mother. "Dr. Carmen," her voice was warm and determined through the speaker, "I saw the news today. I want you to know that 23 of us, all children you treated over the years, have organized. We're going to tell our stories publicly. We want the world to know that you saved our lives, that you gave us futures we never could have had without your care." Mom covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the support from people she'd spent years protecting through anonymity. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. "You don't have to expose yourselves for me." "With respect, Doctora," Carmen Elena said, "you spent 15 years exposing yourself for us. Now it's our turn to stand up for you." That evening, as news vans gathered outside our house and Mom prepared for what would likely be intense scrutiny of her work, I realized that everything was about to change again. The secrets that had defined our family for so long were about to become public, and we would all have to learn how to live in the light instead of the shadows. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt like we were facing the future together as a real family, united by truth instead of divided by silence. "Mom," I said as we watched the sun set through the living room windows, "whatever happens next, we're going to handle it together. No more secrets, no more carrying impossible burdens alone." She reached for my hand, and for the first time in years, her touch felt like home. 6 months later, I stood in the same hospital room where this journey had begun, but everything was different now. Mom was sitting up in her recovery bed, bald from chemotherapy, but radiant with something I'd never seen in her before: peace. The surgery had been successful, the cancer was in remission, and for the first time in decades, she was focusing entirely on healing herself instead of healing everyone else. The room was filled with flowers, cards, and artwork from an unlikely collection of well-wishers. Colleagues from the hospital mixed with families from the underground clinic, creating a gathering that would have been impossible when Mom's work was secret. Children who had grown into adults stood beside their own children, multiple generations connected by the care they'd received from the woman in the hospital bed. "Doctora Carmen," said Miguel Santos, now 22 and wearing his EMT uniform, "my son wanted to give you this." He handed Mom a drawing created by small, careful hands, a stick figure in scrubs with a stethoscope, surrounded by hearts and the words, "Thank you for saving my daddy." Mom's eyes filled with tears as she studied the artwork. "Miguel has a son? Born 3 months ago," Miguel said proudly. "Perfectly healthy lungs, thanks to the treatments you gave me when I was little. We named him David, after the biblical David who faced giants. You taught us that sometimes the smallest person can defeat the biggest problems." I watched this interaction from my chair beside Mom's bed, marveling at how natural it felt to be part of these conversations. Over the past 6 months, I'd become deeply involved in the transition of Mom's underground network into a legitimate nonprofit organization. My graphic design skills had proven unexpectedly valuable in creating educational materials, designing systems for managing volunteer schedules, and developing secure communication platforms for families who still needed protection. Dr. Martinez entered the room carrying a tablet and wearing the satisfied expression of someone with good news to share. "Carmen, I have the latest updates from the board meeting. The Carmen Brooks Foundation received approval for our federal grant. We'll be able to provide fully legal medical services to undocumented families across 3 counties." The foundation had been Marcus's idea. While I'd been learning about the operational side of Mom's work, he'd been researching legal frameworks that could provide similar services without the constant threat of criminal prosecution. Together, we'd helped transition her underground network into an above-ground organization that could serve the same communities, while offering protection for both providers and patients. The governor is planning to attend our official launch next month, Dr. Martinez continued. She wants to use our model as a template for similar programs statewide. Mom shook her head in amazement. A year ago, I was terrified that anyone would discover what I was doing. Now the governor wants to replicate it? That's what happens when you stop hiding your light under a bushel, said a familiar voice from the doorway. Aunt Diane entered with Dad, both of them carrying coffee and the easy familiarity of people who had become unexpected allies in family healing. Dad had been the most surprised by all the revelations. He'd known about Mom's volunteer work, but not about the scope of her underground operations or the personal risks she'd been taking. His initial reaction had been anger, not at the work itself, but at the secrets that had kept him from being able to support her properly. But like the rest of us, he'd moved through anger, into understanding, and then into active participation. The interview requests are still coming in, Dad said, settling into the chair beside Mom's bed. 60 Minutes wants to do a feature story, and there are 3 different documentary crews interested in following the Foundation's first year. I don't need to be the center of attention, Mom protested. The work matters more than any individual person doing it. That's exactly why you should do the interviews, I said. Because you're not trying to become famous. You're trying to normalize the idea that healthcare is a human right, not a privilege based on citizenship status. Over the months since her story became public, Mom had reluctantly become a spokesperson for healthcare access reform. Medical professionals across the country had reached out to share their own stories of providing care in legal gray areas, and immigration advocates had embraced her as a symbol of compassionate resistance to policies that prioritized enforcement over human welfare. The room gradually filled with more visitors, as afternoon visiting hours began. Carmen Elena arrived with her new husband, a young man she'd met in social work school who shared her passion for advocacy. Tyler Kim, my childhood friend who had become a physician's assistant, brought flowers and news that his clinic was implementing training protocols based on Mom's documentation methods. Mrs. Brooks, Tyler said, I wanted you to know that the pediatric residence program is adding a new rotation focused on treating undocumented patients. They're calling it the Carmen Brooks Clinical Experience. Mom looked overwhelmed by the attention, but also deeply moved. I never imagined that breaking the rules would lead to changing them. You didn't break the rules, said a stern voice from the doorway. You followed a higher law. We all turned to see District Attorney Patricia Wells entering the room. She was the prosecutor who had initially threatened to bring charges against Mom when her underground work was first exposed. But after reviewing the extensive documentation Mom had kept, and after meeting dozens of families whose children had received life-saving care, the DA had instead become an advocate for legal reforms that would protect medical providers who offered emergency care regardless of immigration status. The state legislature passed the Emergency Medical Care Protection Act this morning, DA Wells announced. Healthcare providers can no longer face prosecution for offering emergency medical services to any patient, regardless of their documentation status or ability to pay. We're calling it the Carmen's Law. The room erupted in cheers and tears. Legislation named after my mother, passed because her willingness to risk everything had sparked a statewide conversation about healthcare access and human dignity. This means other nurses and doctors won't have to choose between following the law and saving children's lives, Mom said quietly. That's exactly what it means, DA Wells confirmed. Your actions didn't just save individual children. They changed the system that was forcing impossible choices on medical professionals. As evening approached and visitors began to leave, our immediate family gathered around Mom's bed. The 4 of us, Mom, Dad, Marcus, and me, sat together in comfortable silence, something that had been impossible just a year ago when secrets and misunderstandings had kept us emotionally distant, despite living in the same house. I have something for each of you, Mom said, reaching into the bedside table drawer. She pulled out 3 small wrapped packages, handling them with the care reserved for precious things. To Dad, she gave a leather journal, filled with her handwriting. These are all the things I should have told you over the years, she said. The fears I was carrying, The guilt I felt about neglecting our family. The pride I felt watching you be the steady parent when I couldn't be present. I want you to understand how grateful I am that you held our family together when I was falling apart. Dad opened the journal and read the first page, his eyes immediately filling with tears. Carmen, you never fell apart. You just carried more than any one person should have to carry. To Marcus, she gave a folder containing copies of every letter she'd written to him but never sent. These document all the ways I was proud of you, all the moments I missed but thought about constantly, all the advice I wanted to give but didn't know how to offer without revealing too much about where I was spending my time. Marcus flipped through pages of careful handwriting, years of accumulated maternal thoughts and observations. Mom, I always thought you didn't notice me. I thought you were too busy saving other people's children to care about your own son. I noticed everything, she said softly. Your kindness, your intelligence, your strength. I just didn't know how to tell you without also telling you about the work that was consuming so much of my time and attention. To me, she gave a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a ring that had belonged to Sophia, a tiny band with her birthstone, sized for an infant's finger. Sophia would have been your big sister, Mom said. I've always imagined her watching over you and Marcus, proud of the people you became. This ring is the only jewelry I ever bought for her, and I want you to have it as a reminder that love doesn't end with death, and that sometimes the people we lose continue to shape the lives we live. I slipped the ring onto my pinky finger, where it fit perfectly. The weight of it felt significant. Not heavy, but substantial, like wearing a piece of family history that connected me to the sister I'd never known but who had influenced every choice my mother had made. Mom, I said, there's something I need to tell you too. I pulled out my phone and showed her a website I'd been building in secret. I've been documenting the Foundation's work, creating an online archive of stories from families you've helped over the years. But I've also been working on something else. The website was called Letters to Sophia, a space where people could share stories about loved ones they'd lost and how that loss had motivated them to help others. The site had already received hundreds of submissions from people around the world who had channeled grief into service. I wanted to create a place where Sophia's memory could inspire other people the way it inspired you, I explained. A place where loss becomes connection, where private grief becomes public healing. Mom stared at the screen, scrolling through testimonials from parents who had lost children, medical professionals who worked with vulnerable populations, and advocates who fought for policy changes that would prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. You did this for Sophia? I did this for our family, I said. All of us, including the sister I never met but who has been part of my life since the day you started saving other people's children in her memory. That night, after Dad and Marcus had gone home and the hospital had settled into its quiet evening rhythm, Mom and I sat together in the semi-darkness of her room. She was scheduled to go home the next day, officially cleared to begin the next phase of her recovery. The chemotherapy had been brutal, but the surgery had been successful, and her prognosis was excellent. What happens now? I asked. Now I learn how to be a mother again, she said. How to be present for my family while still doing work that matters. How to love you and Marcus without guilt, and how to help vulnerable families without secrecy. What happens with us? I asked. With our relationship? She reached for my hand, her fingers still bearing the calluses of decades of medical work, but softer now, less urgent. Now we get to know each other as adults. You get to decide how much of your mother you want in your life, and I get to learn how to be the kind of mother worth wanting around. I want all of you, I said without hesitation. The healer, the activist, the woman who lost a daughter and spent 30 years trying to save everyone else's children. But I also want the mother who shows up to family dinners, who knows what I'm working on, who shares her fears and hopes instead of hiding behind noble purposes. That sounds like a mother I'd like to learn how to be, she said. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather for early spring in Portland. As we prepared to leave the hospital, Mom paused at the window overlooking the parking lot where families were coming and going, some celebrating recoveries, others facing difficult diagnoses. You know what I realized during all of this? She said. What? I spent so many years thinking I had to choose between saving other people's children and being present for my own. But the real choice was between secrecy and trust. If I had trusted you and Marcus with the truth from the beginning, we could have been partners in the work instead of strangers in the same house. As we walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, I thought about all the ways this building had shaped our family's story. It was where Mom had learned to save lives after losing Sophia, where she had met Dad during his residency, where she had brought countless undocumented children for emergency care, and where she had finally learned to prioritize her own health. In the lobby, we encountered a familiar face. Rosa Gutierrez, the woman whose 4-year-old son had started Mom's underground work 15 years ago, was waiting with a teenage boy who towered over her, but still held her hand like a child seeking comfort. "Doctora Carmen," Rosa said, her English now confident after years of practice. "This is my son Miguel, not the EMT, my other Miguel. He is 16 now, and he wants to become a nurse like you." The teenager stepped forward with the awkward dignity of someone trying to become an adult. "Mrs. Brooks, my mother told me you saved my life when I was 4. I want to learn how to save other children's lives too." Mom's face lit up with the pure joy of seeing her work continue through the next generation. "Have you thought about applying for the Foundation's scholarship program?" "We didn't know there was a scholarship program," Rosa said. "There is now," I said, pulling out my phone to show them the website Marcus had designed for the foundation. "Full tuition support for students from undocumented families who want to pursue careers in healthcare or social services." As we exchanged contact information and made plans for Miguel to visit the foundation's offices, I realized this was what healing looked like. Not just physical recovery from illness, but the restoration of connections that had been broken by fear, misunderstanding, and the weight of carrying impossible secrets alone. The drive home took us through the neighborhoods where Mom had spent countless nights providing underground medical care. But instead of feeling like a tour through a secret world, it felt like a celebration of work that could now happen in the light. "Look," Mom said as we passed a small clinic that had recently opened in a strip mall between a grocery store and a laundromat. "Dr. Martinez opened that last month. Legal, fully funded, serving the same families I used to treat in storage units and basements." The clinic's sign read Sophia Medical Center in both English and Spanish, with a small heart symbol next to the name. Below it, smaller text announced, "Quality healthcare for everyone, no questions asked." "You named the clinic after Sophia?" I asked. "Dr. Martinez did," Mom said. She said Sophia's story needed to be part of the Foundation's public mission, that hiding her memory wasn't protecting her legacy, it was limiting it. As we pulled into our driveway, I saw Dad and Marcus waiting on the front porch with balloons and a "Welcome Home" banner. The scene was so normal, so traditionally familial, that it felt revolutionary after years of missed celebrations and guarded conversations. That evening, we had our first family dinner in months, not because Mom was between crises, not because she was stealing a few hours between shifts, but because she had chosen to be present. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from Marcus's engagement plans to my latest design projects, to Dad's research on healthcare policy reform. "I have an announcement," Mom said as we finished dessert. "I've been offered a position as Director of Community Health Outreach at Oregon Health and Science University. It would involve training medical students in providing culturally sensitive care to vulnerable populations and developing protocols for emergency care that protect both patients and providers." "That sounds perfect for you," Dad said. "It also means I'd be working normal hours, with weekends off, and vacation time that I'd actually be expected to use." Mom continued, "I could be present for family events, help plan Marcus's wedding, maybe even learn what it's like to be a grandmother someday." The possibility of grandchildren seemed distant, but suddenly real in a way it never had before. For the first time, I could imagine Mom as a grandmother who showed up for recitals and birthday parties, who taught medical skills alongside baking techniques, who could share her wisdom without hiding her life's work. "There's one more thing," I said. "I've been thinking about going back to school." Everyone looked at me with surprise. I'd been successful as a freelance designer, but I'd never expressed interest in formal education beyond my bachelor's degree. I want to study public health, I said. Specifically, I want to learn how to design communication systems that help vulnerable populations access healthcare. The work I've been doing with the foundation has shown me that my skills could have broader applications. You want to follow in Mom's footsteps? Marcus asked. I want to build on them, I said. Mom has shown me that one person's willingness to take risks can create ripple effects that change entire systems. I want to learn how to design those ripple effects more strategically. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. I think that's the most beautiful thing you could do with your talents. And I think, Dad said, raising his coffee cup in a toast, this family is finally learning how to dream together instead of apart. 6 months ago, I had been angry at a mother who seemed absent and indifferent, nursing resentment about missed milestones and unexplained absences. Tonight, I was planning my future alongside a woman I was proud to call my mother, someone whose courage and compassion had literally changed laws and saved lives. The voicemail that had started this journey had been an invitation to understanding. But understanding had led to forgiveness. Forgiveness had led to partnership, and partnership had led to something I'd never expected: genuine friendship with the woman who had given me life and then spent decades protecting life for others. As I went to bed that night in my childhood room, surrounded by family photos that finally felt authentic instead of performative, I realized that coming home hadn't just meant returning to my mother's house. It had meant discovering a version of our family built on truth instead of secrets, presence instead of absence, and love that was strong enough to include everyone we cared about, instead of forcing impossible choices between different kinds of family. The bracelet from my 16th birthday still encircled my wrist, its coordinates pointing toward Multnomah Falls, where Mom had once told me that beautiful things were worth the difficult climb to reach them. She'd been right, though neither of us had understood at the time that the most beautiful thing we'd need to climb toward was each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.